Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I've come after them and made a repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some so nearly balls we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is we do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am all apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in it. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that won't sit down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves a darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors.
All right, thanks for joining us today. We're talking about Robert Frost's Mending Wall as it relates to the proposed wall on the southern border of the United States, and we're going to try and articulate out how we feel about this poem, what it says to us about our current moment. So, Mike, go ahead and take us in. Tell us about the Mending Wall.
First, I want to just briefly mention that Frost was actually born in California in a city. He didn't grow up in rural areas or things of that nature. Before World War I, his family moved to California, and then during World War I, actually moved back to America, where he bought a home because he began this homestead and had land, and he actually had a stone wall on his property. Probably,
oh, really?
Yeah, it was probably of the kind that he talks about in this poem, which was the standard. I forget the specific name of it, but the stone walls that were kind of the standard in the Northeast were stacked stones with a gap in between, where they filled it with smaller like gravel and things that they couldn't stack so easily. He probably actually had such a wall on his property, and so that's kind of where that came. He also attended, and he had a long career of being a professor, being a poet. He had many awards and things of that nature, so very well established. But I just thought it would be interesting to note in particular that he probably actually did walk the line himself and mended walls like the one he writes about. So that being said, the other thing that I think is kind of pertinent is the history of the walls. It essentially goes back to revolutionary times, according to this professor from the University of Connecticut that I was reading a brief about. His opinion is that it started from this upswell of American pride after the Revolutionary War, where people wanted to, make their lands look presentable. They wanted to show that we were a stable, proud nation. And so one of the ways that they did that was by removing these piles of rocks they'd collected from their fields and actually stacking them into walls to mark the boundaries between properties. Frost says in the poem, it's not for cattle, it's not for a regular farming purpose like a lot of the walls in the Midwest or out west for ranchers and things. They started more just as boundary markers and to look good. In my searches, I've came across a lot of different interpretations. There's a pretty broad spectrum of everything from people who take a historical perspective and try to interpret it based on the various writings he's had in the past, and they try to develop this sense of his philosophy to then interpret the poem. But generally, they fall into a couple of camps where they either use other sources or they just poem of itself, and then from there decide that it's for walls, it's against walls, or it's proposing a kind of a gray area. I think there's a few other outlier interpretations, like one that I saw on YouTube, that they specifically say that the speaker of the poem is actually completely for walls. That was pretty unique in that they think that the speaker is kind of negative and that he's being an instigator, and that like the hero of the poem, as it were, is actually the neighbor. I thought that was kind of interesting. It was not one I had seen before, but generally they all fit those kind of categories. For me, my overall philosophy is that I think he's actually making a pretty strong argument for a Socratic examination, and that he's looking at these walls, and it's not specifically that a wall is inherently bad, but rather that we should know why we're building the wall, or as he says, whom we're like to give offense when we build it. And we should know, does it serve its purpose? Is it worth the time, the effort, the energy to maintain it? And it's also this pushing against this ignorant loyalty that his neighbor has, where despite the fact that he's just saying, like, do we really need it?
Yeah. The one thing that stood out to me a lot, looking at other people's interpretations of this piece, is those interpretations that are sort of pro walls don't seem to spend a lot of time talking about this moment where he won't go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, "Oh, good walls make good neighbors." I think for me that's a pretty clear, like, we're making fun of this guy.
Yeah.
We're poking fun at the stultified, sort of empty platitude. And that's what he leaves us with, is this sentiment of like it's difficult to engage with this person because he's just jerking off on this dipshit. "Oh, good walls make good neighbors," and he just says it, and then and he's trying to push on him and say, "Hey, why?" And somebody like this. I'm sure everybody that's listening knows somebody in their life where you try and ask them a question that gets a little bit further than just the surface answer, and their reply is just, "Well, that's just the way I think." It seems like that's what he's making fun of here, is just this immediate recourse to like, "Well, my dad said this, so it must be true to now and forever." Or did you not take such a hard line interpretation of that?
Oh no, I think so. I was just more. I'm just kind of thinking on a whole overview. I was trying to just kind of push at like a single interpretation, but as far as the neighbor is concerned, I think it's pretty obvious that not at any point presenting this neighbor as that hero character as a good example, because he literally only speaks twice in the poem, and he says the same thing both times, and gives no support. He doesn't he doesn't offer any other type of argument or anything. Like, it's just this stoic, ignorant, yep, that's how it is. So I don't think the neighbor comes off well here.
No, I didn't think so either. And so I was surprised to see so many readings of it that took this idea that that the neighbor was a sympathetic character. Because from my perspective, he's purely stuck in the ritual. That's what the narrator seems to keep pointing out when he keeps evoking different types of language. He could say elves, which to me, those lines seem to indicate you could say almost anything to this guy about this topic, and you're never going to get any deeper than good fences make good neighbors.
Yeah.
And I know so many people like that, and I guess ultimately that's my feeling, is that this poem is mostly about making fun of those sort of meat and potatoes, archetypical male farm Midwestern. This is how I am, and don't tell me nothing different attitude, and how it basically it stops them from being able to know each other at any level that's deeper than this term neighbor.
And that's one of the great things about Frost, is like on the surface, it can usually be taken as a pretty obvious message, or just sort of like feels right. But you can keep pushing on it, and you can keep finding these other things if you think about it. And You mentioned like the neighbor is building this wall between them in the sense of like building a literal social barrier where he just does not engage the speaker. And I think that is one of those things that's going on in the poem, is he's not looking at just the idea of the physical stone wall, but also some of those other things like, history and tradition and social boundary. And I read an interesting interpretation that talked about how this poem is actually an argument in support of, it is important to bring down those walls to bring people together, but also a wall is a very specific social and cultural and community construct. And, is it a good thing that we bring down barriers all the time? And my big critique with a lot of the interpretations is they cherry pick things. They'll pull out individual words or individual sentences and compare them to other ones, and then ignore what he's literally saying with the words of the line, where he's saying like he won't go behind the saying and he'll only repeat it. He's literally telling us the neighbor is not even willing to entertain the thought of thinking about what the saying means or to understand what's behind it or anything. He likes it so well, he'll only say good fences make good neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Well, I was going to say I don't want to be the guy that always brings the fantasy literature baggage in with him, but like I am that guy. And so for me, a big part of the critique that I get from reading this poem is the narrator pointing out over and over that the neighbor has no imagination, that he has no depth of imaginary thought, of reasoning beyond the historical. And I guess I'm not even sure if historical is the right word, but the like I said before, the platitudes of his father. I think the word elves really jumps off of the page in a way that I don't think any of the other words do. But it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. I guess I fail to see how you could read the poem and then take from that the thrust of Frost's intention here is for us to say, well, this neighbor guy is a pretty fucking smart guy, and we should listen to him, and walls are great. Like, and furthermore, he points out over and over the fucking wall doesn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the irony of the entire poem, is that the whole time it doesn't really matter if it's elves, hunters, time, whatever, and really it doesn't matter whether it's the narrator or the neighbor who is the good guy, so to speak, in the end. I think the hero of the poem is the thing. It's the something. The thing that there is that doesn't love a wall. Like, that's it. I think that thing has the right idea.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's just
yeah.
So much.
I said a bunch there.
So kind of working backwards, I guess. There was one interpretation, and I'm trying to remember what his overall argument was, but he had mentioned that it wasn't entirely clear that the speaker of the poem was not in some way, or the voice of the something, whatever the something is that brings the walls down. It's not entirely clear that he is advocating for the something or is not. But I think it's an interesting idea to think about, like, what if the speaker is the voice of the something?
I mean, that's interesting to think about. I guess my knee-jerk reaction is to say, I feel like the narrator is the one of the two of them who seems to have figured out that this something exists. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say that he's tapped into like a deeper truth, but in some sense, I think that when I read it, I get the impression that the narrator seems willing to think philosophically and think deeply about this sort of benign construct that separates him from his neighbor, and the neighbor, at least in the view that we have from what's on the page, the neighbor does not seem willing to do that at all, and if anything, like, he seems enslaved to the pattern of repair, connected to the seasons and connected to history at such a deep level that he wields the sayings of his father like a savage.
Stone Age, yeah.
For me, that's the interpretation. At least that's the most interesting one that I came across / came up with.
Yeah. I would personally, I would point out still that the speaker is also somewhat beholden to this tradition, in that like he's the one that approaches the neighbor to fix the wall. He's the one that follows after the hunters and fixes the walls. Like also supports the wall, but he's not so blindly loyal to it that like he can't question it, that he can't think about it, or be observant of the forces of the world that act upon it. Because I think, like he says, like something there is that doesn't love a wall. I think it's also pushing that idea that like there's something, i.e., something greater than just this moment, this time, this place. I think he's pushing on, there can be a worldly perspective here, that there's more going on than just, some rocks fell over and I got to pick them up.
Well, I think that's why I said I think the real hero of the poem is the something that doesn't love the wall. And
I like that.
For me, I don't want to inhabit the position of either party that's described in the poem. I don't want to be the guy who maybe he knows that something's not right, but still he's out there with the neighbor. And I mean, I guess that's another way you could interpret the neighbor, is that it's not that he's a slave to those sayings, but it's just that his repetition of it is an omission, or pardon me, it's like an admission of the fact that there's nothing that they can do about the entrenched nature of walls and barriers in our collective conscience.
And it's funny you should say the repetition of it, because like I think the fact that he is the one who repeats it also enforces that idea. He just keeps coming. He just keeps doing the same thing, and evidently has no agency. He just gives in to the something or whatever, and he just comes back year after year.
Well, and it's a shitty platitude as well, because we know on the face of it that it's false. They don't make good neighbors. They don't have anything to do. The walls don't have anything to do with making your neighbors good.
Yeah, and in fact, like in my lived experience, like the presence of a fence literally never benefited the relationship with a neighbor. Like people who actually wanted to were good neighbors who wanted to communicate and be together and whatever. The fence often was a barrier. It was it was in their way of their ability to socialize. The people who like the fences are the ones where you want to keep your neighbors away. Like they don't make good neighbors. They make, good isolation.
I guess maybe it's not that it's a lie directly, the platitude. It's it's like a misdirection, because it's not what the saying means it doesn't have any effect on the good neighbors. What they're actually saying is hide.
Mm-hmm.
Like strong walls make it less likely that what you have will be taken from you. And I mean, I think that's the attitude that the poem brings into question, is like even though we do know that like there is a certain safety that you can have inside of, surrounded by walls, and if you make them stronger out of more powerful materials, it becomes even safer. There is that reality, but at the same time, there's something that nags at the philosophical part of your brain that says, how isn't there a limit to where these barriers are, imminently effective? And I think that's what the poem wants you to start to think about. Is like there's a difference between walling off the room that I'm going to sleep in because you don't want to be the victim of like a petty crime. That's a different thing from putting up these barriers between you and the person that lives next to you, and setting yourself apart from your community in this way. And then furthermore, I would say that even if we were to say, well, it makes some sense for these sort of like what are they, like farmers, agrarian people to have walls separating them, even if we said, well, that's not as morally sound as the wall around your house, but I would argue that it's increasingly shittier as you go further out. So, like, if we started talking about, walling off our city, for example, because, well, it makes good neighbors, I think that would start to be like, well, that's a little bit insane. And then if you start to say, well, let's wall off the state because it'll make the states next to us better, then you're saying, well, that we couldn't possibly want to wall off Iowa to protect us from Illinois. It wouldn't make any sense. And then you say, well, we need to build a wall across our southern border, all thousands of miles of it. And at that point, for me, you're off the rails. It's never going to work. You would spend your whole life. Well, people would spend their whole lives just repairing it.
Yeah. If I can interrupt, I
oh, please.
Because you had said you brought to this your fantasy perspective, and there was one thing I ran across where
I guess it wasn't really a fantasy perspective. I just used that as a preamble to talk about the word elves.
Yeah. However, I think you do have a doorway here that I want to know because I am not the fantasy expert. One of the, I think actually I looked at, of all things, Spark Notes, and it was saying that the words elves, spells, and Stone Age savage were being used to try and evoke this sense of ancient times. And that just bristles against me, and I don't agree with that. If anything, I feel as though he's evoking mysticism and, maybe not exactly spirituality, but certainly like this sort of fantastic element of maybe magic, maybe something or whatever. Like, what do you think about that? What do you think of the mysticism or the fantasy is being engaged through this use of elves and spells?
No, I think it's totally there. Because the whole premise of the poem is that there's like this nature spirit, essence of the forest, or like essence of the world that is against the walls. An ancient druidic power, a secret yet unknown. And then, and he says we have to cast a spell to keep the wall up. And something is always tearing it down, and then he uses the word elves. So, I mean, it seems intentional, and knowing Frost's work, you don't have to read many Frost poems to know that he was not a waster of words. If they're there, they're meant to be there. If anything, like, he might be the greatest American master of having every word be there for a reason. And so, absolutely, he wants to evoke, or from my perspective, it does evoke, images of the spring mischief of the elves coming out and tearing parts of the wall down, the spell of ignorance that they have to cast between them to think that the wall actually matters. I think all of that is intentional. Was that your question?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I think you certainly you certainly answered it for me, because I just was curious to see your take on this idea that, as far as I'm concerned, he's not just evoking an ancient past, but he's also injecting this mysticism and fantasy into this idea.
Well, yeah, and the narrator, I think, is also sort of set up as being a mystical character, or at least being in tune with those mystical elements. Whereas the neighbor is set off as being more benign. And I think that's interesting, and I don't know if you had found this out either, but evidently, like the line there where it is, we do not need the wall, is the halfway point of the poem. He stops using the word we and starts using he, like it literally separates them from that point on.
I first saw that video where he was talking about the speaker is actually advocating for walls, and he's a negative, like, anti-presence. So
he's coming out there to try and the one thing that guy said in the YouTube video. Can you, while I'm saying this, could you look up that video so we can at least say the guy's name?
The channel is xoax.net, and dot is the only about information I could find is his website, xoax.net.
Well, I mean, that's good enough. Anyway, he's the one that organization, and he was the speaker on that video. I don't know how it was set up or whatever, but in any event, that video, he pointed out the separation between the first two halves, and I mean, I think that's cool. He also pointed out this bit about that the something could be love or it could be conquest.
Yep.
I think that's intriguing.
in the various interpretations I saw, like there was a whole gamut of how closely people performed scansion, is the technical term for breaking down poetry,
Mm-hmm.
to the degree of, like, how many words per line, how many, how tenses, things of that nature. And there's some people who give it no mind, and there's some people who seem to, laser those facets only. And so I don't think that it has no value to do that, but I do wonder, when we do that laser focus, are we missing the overarching themes? Are we missing this overall idea? Because it is where the halfway point is, and this tense shift, and the fact that he stops using we and goes to he and I. And for me, I feel like that supports this idea. At least in the previous portion of it, he's thinking of the wall in a more of an abstract of, like, why do these gaps happen and what happens? And here's the boulders that have fallen or whatever. That's sort of the theme of it. And then from that halfway point on, it's more directly the opposition between the speaker and the neighbor, and the separation between them. And I think that just goes further to support that idea that, like, it's not that the speaker or the narrator are particularly the ones look to say, oh, this one's making the correct argument, but rather, like, the overall message is that these walls and the boundaries we build aren't so simple as we shouldn't have them at all, or good fences make good neighbors. I do think there is a little leeway in there, but certainly not just blind loyalty, devotion to the idea one way or the other.
I think that's the big takeaway for me. Is I think you can definitely make an argument one way or the other about the overall position of Robert Frost and this poem on walls. But I do not think, or I have not seen, what I thought was a very robust argument in favor of wanting to inhabit the position of the neighbor.
Yeah.
You do not want to be the neighbor. You do not. I think for sure Frost is saying, whether the wall is good or bad, you do not want to be the person who is just blindly putting the wall back up and ad nauseum repeating the phraseology of your dead fathers.
Yeah.
And I think that's as good of a transition as we're going to get to saying that I would first off state that I think the wall that's proposed on our border is, if nothing else, an odious sort of mechanical reproduction of the faulty sayings of our dead fathers. And I think it would be pretty clear. I don't think Robert Frost would be writing poems extolling, I believe that's the word, extolling the virtue of Trump's proposed wall. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, from what I know of Frost and the poems I've read, I don't get a particularly strong conservative bent. I don't get a particularly strong sense that, I feel like he is pastoral, he's rural, like there is this connection to things that perhaps conservatives usually sort of identify with, but I feel as though he's more the intellectual and the academic, that I don't think he would be so blind or straightforward as to just be completely in one camp or the other. I definitely don't think he'd be out there advocating for a wall, as far as I believe. Well, we may never know.
Yeah, we won't be able to ask him. What we can do though is sort of, I want to just hard shift here, in the interest of time, to catch everybody up to speed. I'm sure anybody listening will know the current state of affairs. But at the time of this recording, the government is shut down, and the president is effectively, I don't know of any other way to put it other than, like, he's just literally holding the government hostage on this one issue of $5 billion to build a small portion of a wall on the southern Mexico border. But just as the Frost poem sort of indicates that we should be thinking more deeply about what walls mean and why we would want them, and if they actually sort of positively propagate any ideas, or conversely, do they reinforce negative ideas? As obviously from what I've said so far, you can gather is my position. Fuck it, Mike. Take us into the stuff that you looked up.
All right. So as far as the Trump wall is concerned, I ran across a quote that I wanted to start with here. It was Hermann Göring, who, for anyone who doesn't know or doesn't want to Google, was a lead Nazi party. He ran the Luftwaffe. He started the Gestapo. Very pivotal person in the Nazi. In an interview, they were talking to him, and he had this to say about the powers of government, I should say, and how that people can be manipulated by governmental power. He says, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. And so I'm of the opinion, especially having read that and research of the wall itself, like that's the rhetoric. That's what's going on. Is we're using, fear mongering to create a crisis to then say, look, you're not doing enough to protect the country, you pacifists, you libtards. So therefore, we need a wall. And I feel like that's the rhetoric that Göring is talking about. You can see that in Trump's speech.
Oh, for sure. And then in case somehow anyone missed it, Trump did a speech where, I mean, even some of the more moderate voices were saying that it was, mostly lies. But the prevailing opinion is that basically just every word out of his mouth was just fear-mongering and lies. The point that we're trying to make here, and the whole reason that we wanted to do this, I don't know, discussion, video, audio recording, whatever it turns out in the end, is this poem seems to really speak to the moment, seems to really make you want to think more deeply about why is it that our leadership is so fixated on us believing that everything that's bad is coming from these people that are to the south of us, who are mostly poorer than us, who are mostly less privileged, who are mostly brown or some color other than white. I think we should be thinking really deeply about why it is that we spend so much of our time talking about how nasty the savages are from below the border. And I think, just as the poem, to my eye, appears to be pretty critical of the person who just recycles rhetoric, I think also we should be increasingly suspicious of people like Trump and like many of his supporters, who seem to just be saying the same faulty, platitudinous, meaningless, lie-ridden rhetorical trash over and over and over again. And so, I mean, I don't know if the poem invites us to challenge those people outright, but certainly, like, it makes you think, if the administration's actions are to use the public square as an outlet for them to stir up fear and hate between American citizens and primarily Mexican immigrants, but also a large number of Guatemalan and other peoples seeking asylum. Why demonize all those people so harshly when we know that the facts are that there is no immigration crisis? We know that it's not a real crisis. It's something that was just made up. But I've said a lot there, Mike. I'm sure you're brimming with things that you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting here scrolling through the text of his speech, and I think part of the really gross rhetoric is, I guess before I even think about that, like, essentially for the part, I agree with everything you're saying. I'm still not 100% sold that it's a completely racial thing, but like it's really hard to not acknowledge that, like, there is a racial component, if nothing else.
You're saying that you don't think that it's entirely racially motivated.
Yeah. I'm saying, like, race is definitely a component. I just, if we were looking at, like, a percentage or a pie chart, I just don't know how much of the pie chart race encompasses, but I'm at least willing to grant it's probably a gross amount.
Well, but fair enough. But instead of trying to figure out what those large pieces of the pie, like what part of the pie do you think is occupied by legitimate concerns and factual based concerns? You know what I'm saying? What portion of our motivation to build this wall is actually truly rooted in good reporting and
border security
and border security and whatever? It just seems to me to be a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, like, there are some basic facts. I think, like, border security is not a null. I mean, I'm also not advocating for, like, zero border security whatsoever. But from the government data I've looked up, from the immigration stats and the numbers I've seen, like, yes, there are people crossing the border. And, like, yes, some non-zero of those people also go on to commit crimes. And, like, yes, some of these issues do have some minor basis in reality, but, like, anytime you push on any of these specific issues he points out, when you dig down to attempt to find facts, it's often things are being omitted, or it's just entirely not true. It's completely fabricated, or it's just like this bizarre hyperbolic overextension of the base fact, or what have you. Like, there's not a stable ground. Like, if we look at that, pie chart analogy, like, how much of it is actually realistic, how much of it is genuine fact, it can't be a huge portion. I mean, it has to be minuscule or marginal. Because, like, I can't find anything that genuinely supports, like, the full on, exclusionary behavior of, we have to do this because it's a crisis, shut down the government, stomp my feet, yell and scream.
Yeah, $5 billion.
Well, and the number is 5.7. So, I mean, we're really talking about $6 billion.
Well, that's true. And, and just so that we're all clear, like, we are to the point now where when I went to type into Google, because I'm concerned about it, like, what's the deal with EBT, with food stamps, with stuff like that. And, like, basically they're paying people's February food stamp monies in the second half of January. And they're just telling you, like, hope you can budget.
Good luck.
Like, literally, that's what they're saying. Is like, well, you should budget because we don't know when it's coming back. Hope your kids aren't hungry.
Even if you're sitting where I was a couple of years ago, where you're almost intentionally ignoring the news, every time I would be exposed to news, I'm hearing things like, longest shutdown ever. And, like, there's this growing feeling of, even coming from, like, the TV talking head people on the local news station, there's this growing sense of, like, oh my God, what's happening? Like, what happens now? Like, there's this feeling of, like, fear and uncertainty just from the fact that the government isn't open. And it's the longest shutdown ever, by several days now.
So, just because this is, effectively like a public forum, and, like, maybe I haven't been clear, or we haven't been clear, and I've just never heard anybody ask this or say this. Why the fuck can anybody shut the government down? Why does our government shut down? Why is that allowed? Why the fuck would we let that be a thing? What the fuck?
Until literally the first time it happened in my lifetime, because I don't know if it had ever happened before that. What was that? 2013, I think, is one of the numbers I saw. There was one government shutdown back when I was alive. That was one of my first thoughts. Is like, is that even possible? Like, what do you mean it's shut down?
Like, you mean we're having an election? And, yeah, like, we're electing new people? Or, yeah, it on the face of it, like, add that to the list of, like, my favorite questions that nobody seems to ask. Why the fuck do we sell weapons to people? Why the fuck do we let moneyed interests into our politics? And I mean, I think this is an equally good oh yeah, well, I mean, like, why do we drone strike people? I think that's a good question too. But anyway, add this to that list of questions that are, like, why would that not be baked in of, like, one of the options that's not available to you as a as an elected official of the government? Like, the move should not be open to you to shut down the government.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost, in my
That would be
mind,
like if you went to McDonald's and they're like, we're
oh, no,
sorry, we can't serve you because the cooks can't agree about whether or not the lettuce is good enough to serve. So they've shut down the whole kitchen
yeah.
until they can
No, I mean,
agree.
it's as ridiculous as the South Park episode where the internet has a big red like button where
Yeah.
like there's a plug-in for the internet and they unplug the internet back in. Like I don't understand like when they first said, "Oh, the government shut down," I thought maybe they just meant like, "Oh, like your local governmental offices, like the lobby is closed, but like the employees are still doing government functions."
Yeah, so like just so that we're absolutely clear, it does not make Trump cool that he has effectively like been the sole cause of the longest government shutdown. I don't know if it's ever or what, but certainly I don't want to say something that's not true. I hadn't read anywhere that it was actually the longest one ever, but like it's pretty long, and it's a shitty move, and like it's dumb, makes no sense, and just the fact that he chose to utilize it in this way on this topic is gross.
The next longest government shutdown was 21 days, and a couple days ago or yesterday, I feel like we were beyond 25 days. Is the greater point? Like
Right.
we are as far as government shutdowns in the U.S. are concerned. Like this is the longest shutdown that the U.S. has ever experienced.
Yep. Out of all of this, because I think we're getting towards where we can wrap this thing up, is when you think about the situation that we're in, where our president is lying in front of the American people. I think a couple days ago he went on the White House lawn and actually denied that he was a foreign operative. I mean, that's effectively why we wanted to do this video, was to increase the number of people who are saying, like, I wasn't fooled. Like, I don't buy his lies. I don't hate Mexicans. I don't think that as the president believes that like they're using unbelievable vehicles in mass, Mad Max style, to assault their way across our border unstoppably to rape and pillage the land. I think that all of this is probably some misdirection or other that's stopping us from talking about real issues, real humanitarian issues. And all of this is couched, I think, inside of this issue of we currently have prison camps on our borders that have children in them. Like we are the bad guys in this scenario, like in this story about a wall. Like the American people via their representatives, like we are the bad guys in this scenario. There's people that are fleeing from drug violence, from war, from food insecurity that's in some degree created by our own policies and choices. All of these people are seeking refuge in this gigantic, prosperous place that is ostensibly a Christian nation. And then when they get here, it turns out that the nation does not actually believe those values. We block you from coming in, and then we malign you as savages and potential criminals. We take your children and put them in camps in which 2 of them have died. Meanwhile, we shut down our own government to argue about whether or not we should do more racist building on our border at the expense of some 800,000 public employees, government employees, and then also the potential like food insecurity of our own people who are using the SNAP EBT program, which overwhelmingly benefits children and the disabled. So this is not a good situation. What we're doing in general is bad, is evil, and Donald Trump is what he appears to just be a psychopathic megalomaniac who will literally say and do anything to what I can only think is just to score a rhetorical like gotcha bitch. Like that's what he wants, is to win. Like I don't think he actually hates Mexicans necessarily. I think a lot of Americans do, but I don't think necessarily that Trump's motive is not to punish Mexico. I think his motive is to win.
Yeah, I think his personality is on display now, and it's become more obvious than ever before. That like part of what's going on is that he's just so stubborn and so fragile that he is not willing to backtrack or to compromise to get the government started again, because it's this personality flaw. I'm gonna win at all costs, and like he's too embarrassed or whatever to admit that, like, fine, maybe I'm wrong. Let's find a way to work it out. He's just going to keep hammering that same thought over and over. Give me my money, because like he just, his personality is such, he cannot give ground to his own detriment and to, unfortunately, the potential detriment of millions of Americans. And yeah, it's horrible, horrendous. There's not really an adequate word to describe the fuckery that's going on. And if it wasn't clear before, like I do think like maybe we should come out and like explicitly state it. Like, I am not for a wall, like, period.
No, nor am I.
But you know, if we went down the list of all of the arguments, like, there's other solutions that we can work on. There's other ways that we could spend $6 billion to correct the basic issues that are causing some of these things, other than just walling off the border. And, you know, it's this literal and metaphoric, like, just put a barrier up, out of sight, out of mind. I'm not going to deal with it. I don't care. It's isolationist. It's ignorant. It's so many things.
And it doesn't work. It's not, it wouldn't work anyway. And it doesn't even, the problem that it would solve is fictitious. But even if the fictitious problem was real, it still wouldn't solve the problem.
Yeah. So I mean, we were just talking a couple days ago, like, hilarious, watching the news. They showed a Trump tweet where he was saying, oh yeah, there's 77 major walls worldwide and they're 100% effective. And immediately after that is the person he was quoting saying, nope, no major wall has ever succeeded at keeping out people.
No, and that's a, I think that's a troubling thing, that, like, it's a habit, evidently, of Trump's, is just to say, oh, I talked to all the previous presidents and that are living, and they said that it was a great idea. And then they all had to come out and say, like, nope, we didn't. Because he'll just take whatever platform he can and use it to just propagate more garbage.
And I'm not sure of the specific. I mean, I don't know if he's doing it intentionally, if it's designed, or if it's just that's who he is. But like that style of rhetoric where you're just going to make whatever claim you can possibly get out and see what sticks, has the unfortunate side of bringing all claims into doubt. Because once you've established that, like, you're the supreme liar, essentially, not everyone is gonna listen to, you know, fact, or not everyone just take what you're saying at face value.
Yeah, and so in summary,
all facts become questions.
Yeah, and so in summary, the poem is great. We love Robert Frost's work in general. You know, we are Americans in that way. Like, I've been reading him since I was a boy.
And it may be worth noting, we both collected works as published by the Library of America. It's a very great edition. So
yeah, I would recommend those. So, if you enjoyed what you just heard, we're gonna have a couple different things happening in the next couple weeks. Ideally, we're gonna be doing some book reviews on varying topics. Our first one is going to be on a science fiction book published on Kindle, Spinward Fringe. And then we also have lined up a couple more videos on this topic of the wall and of American politics. So if you enjoyed this, stop on by for the next one when you see it pop up. Yeah, I can't believe that we're now in a state of being where the president of the United States can claim that we need to build a wall because Mexico drug cartels are constructing Mad Max vehicles and driving them across our border. You feel like he's the president of... He destroys your ability to use the phrase, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." He is the single-handed destroyer of that phrase, because you'd be saying it almost every day, because every time he opens his fucking mouth, he says the dumbest thing that you've ever heard. It's like if you went to a restaurant and... just play the fucking music.